Before us now is House Bill 2025, a bill to amend the Code of Virginia relating to religious freedom, marriage, solemnization, participation, and beliefs. Report of the Committee on General Laws. And, Mr. Speaker, there is a floor amendment.
The gentleman from Culpeper, Mr. Freitas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move the floor amendment.
Clerk will report a floor amendment.
Floor amendment offered by Delegate Freitas to the introduced version on line 32, after the word penalty, strike, comma, any civil liability or any other action.
The questions on adoption of the floor amendment offered by the gentleman from Culpeper, Mr. Freitas, has made his favor of that motion will say aye.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Charlottesville,
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman explain his floor amendment before we vote on it?
Will the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I'll yield, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields.
I thank the gentleman. The reason why we did this floor amendment is obviously we've gotten a lot of response to this bill, both in favor and in opposition. And there were some people in opposition that were afraid that we might have been pushing a little bit too far with respect to things that could drip over into the criminal side with respect to this bill. I didn't think that was the case, but if it was an opportunity to assuage some of those concerns, we were happy to take that, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield for another question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the gentleman, anytime lawyers in this body hear the word immunity from civil liability, they get all worked up. So I'm wanting to make sure I understand. Are you eliminating that clause?
That's correct, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions on adoption of the floor amendments made in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Floor amendments agreed to. Gentleman from Culpeper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What HB 2025 does is it's actually the bill that we all voted on last year, and we were assured last year that a bill like this wasn't necessary because we already had religious freedom in the Commonwealth, and that the Commonwealth or its agents were not allowed to infringe on the religious liberty of institutions. And yet we had the governor's executive order, which I believe does just that, or at least creates a mechanism where that can be accomplished. So I regret that this is necessary, Mr. Speaker. I really wish that this governor, which has already have a track record now for going beyond his constitutional authority, could have respected that religious liberty, but I think he's made it obvious that he won't. And so now we have to put our religious institutions, we have to put religious organizations, to include our charities, in a position where they know they are not going to be punished by the state if they hold to the belief that marriage is between a man and a woman. I hope it'll be the pleasure of the body to engross the bill and move it to its third reading.
Gentleman from Alexandria, Mr. Levine.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman rise for a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask the gentleman, and I have the bill in front of me, it says that person is defined as a religious organization or someone connected with a religious organization. And then it says that no person shall be required to participate in the solemnization of any marriage. And I would ask the gentleman, Mr. Speaker, which person in Virginia is required by law to participate in the solemnization of any marriage?
I would answer, gentlemen, the primary concern here, again, has to do with the governor's executive order, where he has made it very clear that certain religious institutions would not be able to engage in state contracts for a variety of things, to include things like refugee resettlement, because they hold to a position that marriage is between a man or a woman. So again, it's not as if we have a specific case where a pastor, priest, rabbi, imam has been required to do this. But again, the concern comes from the governor's positive actions with respect to his executive order.
Mr. Speaker, a follow-up question. Will the gentleman yield?
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
The gentleman yields.
So, Mr. Speaker, I would ask the gentleman, is there any person in Virginia that he's aware of that is required by law, executive order, or any other legal compulsion, is required to participate in the solemnization of any marriage, which is what line 31 of the bill says? Does he know of any?
The question is after the governor's executive order, would someone, maybe they wouldn't be required to perform the marriage. The question is, would they be punished if they refused to perform a marriage that didn't coincide with their religious beliefs, Mr. Speaker?
I thank the gentleman.
Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Simon.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the effort that's gone into this bill, and I understood the explanation that this is to try and undo the governor's executive order, but it looks to me like this is broader than that, so I want to ask a question about that. It says in section B2, right, that no person would be subject to any penalty or any other action by the Commonwealth solely on account of such person's belief, speech, or action in accordance with a belief or moral conviction that marriage is not or should not be recognized as the union of one man and one woman. So this is very broad. There's no penalty at all. So I guess my question would be, my sister-in-law and her wife and their 2 kids come to Virginia frequently to visit us. And if, God forbid, on their way to Virginia to visit us, they're in a car accident, and the ambulance says the closest hospital to you is a Catholic hospital, Catholic Charities Hospital, and that's where we're going to take you because your life and limb are at stake. And then my sister-in-law's wife wants to go back into the ER to see her spouse, and she's denied access to her spouse because somebody there doesn't recognize that as a valid marriage. Would that hospital be completely protected and within their rights to deny her access to her loved one in such a circumstance?
I would answer the gentleman, Mr. Speaker, that the floor amendment took out any civil liability or any other action by the Commonwealth. That's the portion that we took out of the bill, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker, further question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields.
But doesn't it say really, I mean, you took out civil liability, but doesn't it say any penalty at all? I mean, doesn't the fact that it says any penalty mean that the Commonwealth couldn't do anything to that hospital?
Mr. Speaker, I think once again we're talking about the specifics with respect to the solemnization, the marriages between one man and one woman. The idea, again, I would ask the gentleman, does he know of any Catholic hospital that has ever denied this to somebody?
Mr. Speaker, I am not familiar with any particular case where this has happened, although I have heard of it happening in the Commonwealth. I've heard stories of this happening around the country, yes. Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill at the appropriate time.
At the appropriate time. Gentleman from Prince William, Mr. Marshall.
Speaking to the measure.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I urge members here to support this because the patron of the bill is correct. The governor's Executive Order 61 intends to include, or rather exclude, religious organizations from any contract with the Commonwealth of Virginia if you don't submit to his sexual, ideological, venereal passions about who can have a contract and who cannot have a contract. So this would mean a Catholic daycare, whatever, would not be eligible, or a Catholic refugee or a Baptist refugee that followed biblical principles would not be able to receive a contract. And last night, Mr. Speaker, at a subcommittee, which I had a bill to basically nullify Executive Order 61, it was acknowledged by the governor's office, by the ACLU and Equality Virginia, when I pointed out that religious organizations would be included. None of them denied the accuracy of that statement. Now, sadly, again, this was killed on a voice vote on laying on the table. So apparently we're going to do nothing, perhaps other than this, to challenge the governor. And I urge the members to challenge the governor on this because he does not have the authority, one, to add either sexual orientation or gender identity, or number two, to deny religious organizations. And if you look right behind me, the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty is here and has been part of the fabric of our Constitution for more than 200 and some years. So I urge you to accept what the gentleman from Culpeper is doing, mindful that religious organizations, absent this, will be corralled into the governor's net that he seeks to impose.
The gentleman from Fairfax. I'm sorry, the gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Simon.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, I would hope that there'll be the pleasure of this body not to vote for this bill again. This bill doesn't really solve a problem. We have a Religious Freedom Restoration Act of Virginia, a Virginia RFRA Act. We've got a number of statutes already on the books in Title 2.2, 43, that make it illegal for public bodies in procuring goods or services to discriminate against a faith-based organization on the basis of that organization's religious character, or impose conditions or restrict the religious character of that organization. So this issue, if it's really just about contracting and being able to do business with the Commonwealth, we've got statutes which already supersede the governor's executive order And if there was a problem, you wanted to challenge the governor's executive order, you have statutes in the code that already address the very narrow problem that the patron says this bill is trying to solve. What this bill is really doing is it's a message bill. And I have plenty of message bills on my side. I know what a message bill looks like. It's a message bill. It's designed to send a message. Unfortunately, I think it's going to send the wrong message to the rest of the United States. It's going to say that we are on the same side as North Carolina, that we are on the wrong side of this argument, that we are not welcoming to all kinds of people, regardless of who they love, that we are going to embrace a culture of discrimination and not an open culture that is, welcoming and inviting to everybody. And it's not the message we want to send if we want to go ahead and have a 21st century Virginia economy. We need to be in the 21st century in all aspects if we want to have a 21st century economy that can compete. And I really want you all to think carefully about the message that you're sending if you vote yes on this bill. I hope that it will be the pleasure of the body not to engross the bill, not have it passed on to its third reading.
The gentleman from Alexandria, Mr. Levine.
Mr. Speaker, also speaking to the bill.
The gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, the gentleman, the patron of the bill, has, as far as I can see, basically conceded that the first part of the bill, that somehow someone is required to participate in solemnization of any marriage, there isn't anyone required to do that. His concern, I guess, is with the second part of the bill, that people might be penalized if they somehow discriminate against gay families. So I don't know an example in Virginia, I concede that, but I can tell you that there's a woman at my synagogue who was married to, it wasn't legal at the time, so she was with her female partner in Texas for more than 20 years. She was also estranged from her family for more than 20 years because her family would not accept her as a lesbian woman. This was the woman's partner. The woman's partner died, and as she was dying, the family came in and excluded the woman I know, the woman that she'd been with for 20 years, excluded her from the hospital room because there were no protections in Texas, excluded her from any kind of inheritance. They didn't have a will. And basically the family came in and this poor woman died with people that she did not get along with and was not allowed to be with her partner of 20 years. It seems to me that hospitals should allow people to be with their loved ones. And if the purpose of this bill is to separate loved ones as they're dying, then I think that's a very bad point of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Culpeper, Mr. Freitas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
I can't say it enough, Mr. Speaker, that the point of this bill is not to separate loved ones. The point of this bill is not to bring offense to anybody within the homosexual, the LGBTQ community. I realize that regardless of my intentions, that may be the effect for some people, but it certainly is not the intent. The problem is there are going to be key questions that people disagree on. And if it were up to me, government would not even be involved in the question of marriage. I would love it if government just got out of this question altogether and if we just treated marriage like a civil contract. I would like it to be just a civil contract between two people, and then my definition of marriage, which will never change because it's given to me by Scripture, I can go and exercise that, and someone else that has a different description of it, they can go into the private sector and they can find a church, synagogue, mosque, secular institution, whatever it is, to define it for them. I would be happy with that, but that's not the reality we live in right now. And unfortunately, this governor has decided, because when I see this, Mr. Speaker, what I see is targeting religious organizations, religious charities. Again, I heard 3 eloquent speeches with respect to refugee resettlement yesterday. All right, and while I agree with President Trump on certain things, I disagree on others. And I will say this, the idea that we would take Catholic charities, or that this executive order could potentially exclude Catholic charities from being able to serve that purpose of successfully resettling refugees is a problem. And so I would just say that, again, at the end of the day, there's no offense meant by this bill. Again, I wish it wasn't necessary. But as long as we have people that are willing to occupy the governor's office or come here in order to force one side of this debate to agree with them by punishing them through the government, we're going to continue to have bills like this that seek to protect those institutions. So with that, Mr. Speaker, again, I would just reiterate, I hope it'll be the will of the body to engross the bill and move it to its third reading.
Shall the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading? As many as favor that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Bill is engrossed and passed to its third reading.